A billionaire's son was dying, and no amount of money could buy the one thing that might keep him alive. Leo was only 6 years old when the disease began eating through his blood, slow enough that he could still laugh on good days, dangerous enough that every doctor in the hospital lowered their voice when they spoke about him. His body rejected most treatments. His fevers came without warning. His heartbeat weakened in the middle of the night, and every few weeks, his skin turned so pale that the nurses stopped pretending everything was fine. Only one thing could stabilize him: AB negative blood, a rare blood type that less than 1% of the population carried. For Alexander Kane, that fact was almost insulting. He owned towers, hospitals, research labs, and enough influence to make powerful men bow before entering his office. He could summon the best specialists in the country with one phone call. He could fund experimental medicine that other families could only dream of. But none of that mattered when his son needed blood no one could find. Then, 2 years ago, someone appeared. No name, no demand, no request for money. Once every month, the same anonymous donor came to the hospital, rolled up his sleeve, gave blood, and left before Alexander could be informed. The donation was always perfectly timed. Whenever Leo's condition dropped close to the danger line, the blood was there, clean, compatible, life-saving. The hospital director called it a miracle. Alexander called it suspicious. But even he could not deny the truth. For 24 months, that anonymous donor had kept his son alive. What Alexander did not know was that the person saving Leo was not a famous doctor, not a wealthy sponsor, not some noble Omega from a respected family. It was Caleb, an Omega who worked as a cleaner in the same hospital. Every month, Caleb entered the donation room through the back corridor before sunrise. He signed the protected form with tired hands, sat quietly while the nurse checked his vitals, and never asked how Leo was doing until the needle was already in his arm. Then he always asked the same thing: "Is he still holding on?" And the nurse, who knew too much and said too little, always answered the same way: "Because of you." Yes, that was enough for Caleb. After each donation, he rested for only a few minutes, took cheap suppressant tablets from his pocket, and returned to work before the morning shift filled the halls. By the time doctors began rushing past with charts and visitors crowded the waiting room, Caleb was already there, pushing a mop bucket across the polished floor as if nothing had happened. No one looked at him for long. To most people in the hospital, he was only the weak Omega cleaner who kept his head down, someone easy to order around, someone who apologized even when he had done nothing wrong. When nurses spilled coffee, they called him. When visiting relatives tracked mud through the hallway, they called him. When someone complained about the scent of disinfectant, they blamed him for not cleaning properly. Caleb accepted it all without argument. Not because he had no pride, because he had no room left for pride. His body had grown weaker over the past 2 years. Some mornings, his fingers shook so badly that he had to grip the mop handle with both hands. Sometimes after climbing one flight of stairs, black spots swam across his vision. The suppressants made his throat dry and his stomach twist. But he swallowed them anyway, because an Omega's pheromones could attract trouble. And trouble was something he could not afford. The only person in the hospital who seemed to notice him was Leo. The child did not know Caleb was his donor. No one had told him. Alexander had forbidden unnecessary contact with strangers, and Leo's doctors guarded his room like a fortress. But children noticed what adults ignored. Whenever Caleb cleaned the corridor outside Leo's private room, Leo would watch him through the glass panel. Sometimes he lifted one small hand in greeting. Caleb always smiled back quickly before lowering his gaze, afraid someone might scold him for being too familiar. Leo was afraid of the hospital. He hated the smell of medicine, hated the machines, hated the way adults smiled too brightly when they were scared. At night, the nurses said he often cried until he exhausted himself. Caleb learned that by accident. One evening while wiping the floor near Leo's room, he heard the boy whispering through tears, "I don't want another needle." Caleb froze. The nurse inside tried to comfort him, but Leo only turned his face into the pillow. Something in Caleb's chest tightened painfully. He should have walked away. He was only a cleaner. He had no right to enter that room. Instead, he stood outside the door and softly hummed an old melody under his breath. Leo stopped crying. The nurse looked toward the door confused, but Caleb had already stepped back into the corridor, pretending to clean a stain that was not there. From then on, whenever Leo had a bad night, Caleb found a reason to be nearby. He never crossed the line. He never introduced himself. He only stayed close enough for the child to feel less alone. But Alexander noticed nothing. To Alexander, the hospital was a battlefield. He entered with bodyguards, received medical updates, signed approvals, and left with a colder expression each time. He was known as a ruthless alpha, the kind of man who did not raise his voice because he never needed to. Doctors feared disappointing him. Investors feared crossing him. Even the hospital director straightened his back whenever Alexander stepped through the doors. Caleb always moved out of his way. Every time Alexander passed, Caleb lowered his head and pulled his cart closer to the wall. He told himself it was safer that way. A man like Alexander lived in a world above his. A man like Alexander did not need to know the name of the Omega cleaning the floor beneath his shoes. Then came the 24th donation. That morning, Caleb knew something was wrong before the needle even touched his skin. His pulse was too fast. His hands were cold. The nurse frowned at his chart and said he should skip this month. Caleb shook his head. "Leo's fever came back last night, didn't it?" The nurse did not answer. That silence was enough. So Caleb gave blood again. Afterward, he tried to stand. But the room tilted. The nurse told him to rest longer. Caleb promised he would, then waited until she stepped out before leaving through the side door. He still had work to finish. The VIP wing had to be cleaned before Alexander arrived. He made it halfway to the storage room before his knees weakened. The mop slipped from his hand. The metal handle struck the floor with a sharp sound that echoed through the empty corridor. Caleb reached for the shelf, missed it, and collapsed behind the stacked boxes of cleaning supplies. For a few seconds, all he could hear was his own breathing. Then footsteps stopped outside the open door. Alexander had arrived earlier than expected. He looked into the storage room, irritated by the noise at first, then completely still when he saw the Omega on the floor. Caleb's sleeve had fallen back, revealing fresh gauze over the bend of his arm and old needle marks scattered beneath it. Alexander stepped closer, and then he smelled it. Not the harsh scent of disinfectant. Not blood. Not medicine. A faint Omega pheromone, weak from suppressants and exhaustion, but strangely warm beneath it all. Familiar in a way that made Alexander's alpha instinct sharpen before his mind understood why. Caleb forced his eyes open and saw him. For the first time, Alexander was not looking through him. He was looking directly at him. And the silence between them felt more dangerous than any question Alexander could have asked. After that day in the storage room, something changed. Alexander told himself it was nothing important at first. The Omega cleaner had fainted because he was overworked. Hospitals were full of exhausted people. Doctors collapsed during double shifts. Nurses survived on caffeine and painkillers. There was no reason for him to keep thinking about 1 week Omega with trembling hands and tired eyes. But 3 days later, Alexander still remembered the scent. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not because it was strong. In fact, it was barely there beneath layers of suppressants and disinfectant. Yet something about it lingered in his mind like a memory he could not place. Every time he walked through the hospital now, his instincts reacted before his thoughts did. His eyes searched the hallways automatically. And every single time, he found Caleb somewhere nearby, quietly wiping windows, replacing trash bags, pushing his cleaning cart down the corridor with his head lowered while everyone else rushed past him like he did not exist. Alexander started noticing things he should not have noticed. Caleb always worked the late shifts around Leo's floor. Even when other cleaners rotated apartments, he always disappeared for almost an hour before Leo's scheduled treatments. He avoided eye contact whenever Alexander was near, but never avoided Leo. And Leo behaved differently around him. That was the strangest part. Leo hated hospitals. He refused medication half the time. He barely spoke to the specialists Alexander hired at ridiculous prices. Some nights, he screamed whenever nurses approached with needles. But the moment Caleb appeared near the room, Leo calmed down. At first, Alexander thought it was coincidence. Then he saw it himself. Leo had been running a fever since dawn. His small body shook under the blankets while the nurse adjusted the 4-line for the third time. Alexander stood beside the bed, listening to another doctor explain treatment options he had already heard before. More tests. More waiting. More uncertainty. Then the crying started. "I don't want it," Leo whispered weakly. "It hurts." The nurse tried soothing him, but Leo turned his face away. Alexander clenched his jaw. Nothing made him feel more useless than moments like this. Suddenly, Leo stopped crying. Alexander looked up. Caleb was outside the room, slowly cleaning the glass window with a cloth in his hand. He was not even looking directly inside. He simply hummed softly under his breath while working. And Leo listened. The child's breathing gradually steadied. His fingers loosened from the blanket. Within minutes, his eyes drifted closed. The room fell silent. Even the nurse looked confused. Alexander stared at the Omega outside the glass longer than he should have. Later that evening, Alexander walked out of Leo's room after another phone call from the board of directors. Investors wanted updates. The media was asking questions again. Every conversation lately felt like another weight pressing against his skull. As he turned the corner, he found 2 nurses speaking in low voices near the supply station. "That cleaner from floor 7 smells weird lately. He's probably skipping suppressants again. An Omega like him should know better. If an Alpha loses control because of him, it'll become everyone's problem." They laughed quietly. Alexander normally ignored gossip. Today, something about their tone irritated him immediately. "Do you have enough free time to discuss hospital cleaners during work hours?" The 2 nurses went pale. "Director Kane, if you're done chatting, go back to work." They bowed repeatedly before hurrying away. Alexander continued walking, but his expression remained cold. He did not understand why the conversation annoyed him so much. Meanwhile, Caleb knew something was wrong with himself too. Suppressants were becoming less effective. Every time he got close to Alexander lately, his heartbeat sped up painfully. His pheromones reacted in ways they never had before. Even worse, Alexander's presence lingered around him long after the Alpha left the room. It terrified him. A man like Alexander could destroy someone like him without even trying. Powerful Alphas rarely noticed lower-class Omegas unless they wanted something. Caleb had spent his entire life learning how to stay invisible around men like that. So why was Alexander suddenly paying attention to him? That question followed Caleb through every shift. One night, after finishing cleanup in the pediatric wing, Caleb quietly entered Leo's room while the child slept. The nurse on duty had stepped away for medication records, leaving the room empty except for the soft beeping of machines. Caleb carefully placed a tiny, repaired music player beside the bed. A week ago, he had found Leo crying because it stopped working. One of the buttons had broken off completely. The hospital staff promised to replace it eventually, but Leo kept asking for the same one because his late mother had bought it for him. So Caleb spent 3 nights fixing it himself. He pressed the button gently. Soft music filled the room. Leo stirred awake almost immediately. His tired eyes widened when he saw the music player. "You fixed it." Caleb smiled awkwardly. It wasn't too broken. Leo hugged it tightly against his chest. "Thank you." The words were quiet, but they hit Caleb harder than they should have. Nobody thanked him for anything anymore. Not for cleaning. Not for overtime. Not for giving blood until his body shook afterward. Caleb looked down quickly before Leo could notice the emotion in his face. You should sleep now. Will you come tomorrow too? Caleb hesitated. Then he nodded once. Unfortunately, Alexander saw the entire interaction from the doorway. Neither of them noticed him standing there. Alexander watched Leo smile brighter than he had in weeks. He watched Caleb adjust the blanket carefully around the child's shoulders with hands so gentle they did not seem real. Something heavy shifted inside Alexander's chest. For the first time in months, Leo looked safe. Not cured. Not healthy. But safe. And somehow that feeling existed only when Caleb was near. The next few days became worse for Alexander in ways he could not explain. His stress levels kept climbing as Leo's condition fluctuated again. The pressure from the company, the hospital, and his family built constantly around him. Sleep became impossible. Alpha instincts grew unstable from exhaustion. Then came the rut. Mild at first. Short temper. Restlessness. Heightened senses. Normally, Alexander controlled himself easily. He had spent years mastering that control because powerful alphas who lost themselves became dangerous. But this time felt different. His instincts reacted violently every time another alpha approached Caleb. One afternoon, Alexander walked into the hallway outside Leo's room and immediately caught the scent of another alpha lingering nearby. His eyes landed on a young resident doctor standing too close to Caleb while speaking casually. Caleb looked visibly uncomfortable. The doctor leaned closer. You really should stop using cheap suppressants. I can smell your pheromones from here. Caleb stepped back immediately. I need to return to work. Before the doctor could answer, Alexander spoke coldly from behind him. Shouldn't you be checking patient charts instead of cornering hospital staff? The doctor froze. Alexander's pheromones filled the corridor instantly, sharp enough to make the younger alpha pale. I apologize, Director Kane. Then leave. The doctor walked away without another word. Caleb lowered his head quickly. Thank you. Alexander looked at him carefully. Up close, Caleb looked exhausted again. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and his hands seemed unsteady against the cleaning cart handle. Then Alexander noticed the sleeve of Caleb's uniform had slipped slightly downward. Old needle marks covered his arm. Not one or two. Dozens. Fresh ones mixed with older scars. Caleb realized where Alexander was looking and immediately pulled the fabric down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then alarms suddenly rang from inside Leo's hospital room. Nurses rushed past them. Alexander's instincts snapped toward the sound immediately. But before he moved, another scent reached him first. Caleb's. Soft, warm, familiar. And for the first time in years, Alexander's violently unstable alpha instincts calmed. Almost instantly. The realization hit him hard enough to stop him mid-step. Something about this Omega was no longer normal. Alexander did not sleep that night. After the incident outside Leo's room, one thought refused to leave his mind. The needle marks. There had been too many. No hospital cleaner should have scars like that. By morning, Alexander had already ordered a full investigation into every private medical record connected to Leo's treatment over the past 2 years. The hospital director resisted immediately. Confidentiality laws protected anonymous donors, especially rare blood cases. Even the senior specialists avoided discussing it openly. Normally, Alexander would have accepted the legal boundaries. Not this time. Someone has been keeping my son alive for 2 years, he said coldly inside the director's office. And now I find out that same person is collapsing inside your hospital while nobody tells me anything. The director lowered his eyes. Director Kane, I'm done waiting. The pressure in the room became unbearable. Even the alpha doctors avoided meeting Alexander's gaze directly. Finally, the oldest person in the room spoke. Professor Chin, the head physician overseeing Leo's treatment. removed his glasses slowly before looking at Alexander with visible exhaustion. "You were never supposed to find out like this." Alexander's jaw tightened. Professor Chen continued quietly. "The donor requested complete anonymity from the beginning. Every month, he signed the consent forms himself. Every month, we told him to stop. The professor nodded once. Then he slid a thin medical file across the desk. Alexander opened it and froze. Name, Caleb Chen. Blood type, AB negative. Occupation, hospital custodial staff. Monthly donation records filled page after page. 24 consecutive months. Additional emergency donations. Declining health indicators. Severe anemia warnings highlighted repeatedly in red. Several reports carried the same recommendation. Donor no longer physically fit for continued extraction. Yet beneath every warning was the same signature. Caleb Chen. Alexander stared at the pages for several seconds without moving. Something dark twisted violently in his chest. He kept donating after this. The voice sounded dangerously calm. Professor Chen hesitated. Leo's condition worsened 6 months ago. Without compatible blood, his survival chances would have dropped significantly. So you allowed an Omega to destroy his own body instead. We tried stopping him. Clearly not hard enough. Professor Chen sighed heavily. You think I don't know that? Every month, he came back weaker. Every month, he promised it would be the last time. Then Leo's condition would drop again, and he'd return before dawn asking if the child was still alive. Silence filled the office. Alexander suddenly remembered every moment he had passed Caleb in the hospital halls without truly seeing him. The exhausted eyes, the trembling hands, the faint scent of suppressants, the way he always looked like he was barely standing. And all this time, that Omega had been bleeding himself dry for Leo. Alexander stood abruptly. Where is he? Professor Chen's expression changed immediately. He's donating again. For one terrifying second, Alexander thought he heard wrong. Then he saw the time on the wall clock. Emergency transfusion schedule. Leo's fever had spiked again overnight. Alexander left the office without another word. By the time he reached the restricted medical wing, several nurses were already rushing around the donation room. One of them tried stopping him at the door. Director Kane, you can't. He shoved the door open anyway. The sight inside made something inside him snap instantly. Caleb sat slumped in the medical chair with a needle in his arm. His skin looked frighteningly pale beneath the harsh white lights. Sweat clung to his forehead, and his fingers shook so badly that the tubing beside him trembled visibly. One of the nurses was speaking urgently. Your blood pressure is dropping too fast. We need to stop now. Caleb shook his head weakly. Leo, his voice barely came out properly. Leo needs it. Your body can't handle another full extraction. It's okay. No, it isn't. The nurse reached for the equipment controls. Caleb grabbed her wrist before she could stop the process completely. Please. The movement was weak, desperate. Then Alexander noticed something horrifying. Blood had begun flowing backward through part of the tube because Caleb's pulse was becoming unstable. The nurse cursed softly under her breath. Everything after that happened fast. Alexander crossed the room immediately while the staff scrambled around the machines. Caleb looked up slowly at the sudden movement, eyes unfocused from exhaustion. The moment he recognized Alexander, panic flickered across his face. You shouldn't be here. Alexander ignored him completely. Stop the extraction. Now. But Leo, I said stop. Nobody argued with him this time. The machines were disconnected immediately, while another nurse tried stabilizing Caleb's condition. Caleb attempted to sit upright but nearly collapsed sideways instead. Alexander caught him before he hit the floor. The contact stunned both of them. Caleb's body was frighteningly light. Too light. Alexander could feel the weakness immediately beneath the thin hospital blanket wrapped around him. His hands tightened unconsciously. What the hell were you thinking? Alexander demanded quietly. Caleb avoided his eyes. Leo was getting worse. And if you die? Caleb did not answer. That silence angered Alexander more than anything else. You think your life means nothing? It's not like that. Then explain it to me. Caleb looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. Exhausted in a way Alexander did not understand yet. He's just a child. The words were soft. Simple. But they hit harder than shouting would have. Caleb lowered his gaze again before continuing weakly. Every time I hear he's hurting, I keep thinking, if I can still help, then how am I supposed to walk away? For the first time in years, Alexander had no immediate response. The room grew quieter around them. Even the nurses stopped moving so loudly. Alexander looked down at the Omega in his arms and realized something. Nobody had ever protected Caleb. Not the hospital staff. Not society. Not even himself. Caleb had simply continued giving pieces of his body away because nobody else could save Leo. And he had done it completely alone. A strange pressure built inside Alexander's chest again. Heavier this time. Dangerous. Possessive. Protective. Before he could fully process it, Caleb suddenly tried pulling away. I need to go back to work. Alexander stared at him like he had lost his mind. You're barely conscious. The pediatric floor still needs cleaning before visitors arrive. Something in Alexander's expression darkened visibly. Even now, after collapsing during a blood donation, Caleb's first concern was returning to mop hospital floors. The realization made Alexander irrationally angry. Without warning, he lifted Caleb into his arms completely. The nurses froze. Caleb's eyes widened in shock. What are you doing? You're done working today. I can walk. No, you can't. Alexander. The name slipped out accidentally. Both of them noticed immediately. Caleb looked horrified at himself. Alexander, however, felt something tighten sharply inside him. Hearing his name spoken in that weak, breathless voice, he looked down at Caleb carefully. And for the first time, he stopped seeing a hospital cleaner. He saw the person who had kept Leo alive for 2 years while destroying himself in silence. As Alexander carried him out of the donation room, hospital staff throughout the hallway stared openly. Some looked shocked, others confused. But Alexander ignored every single one of them. The only thing he noticed was how cold Caleb's hands felt against his shirt. Then, just before they reached the elevator, 2 executives from the Kane family entered the corridor, speaking quietly to each other. Neither noticed Caleb was awake. As long as the Omega survives, one muttered, the family's bloodline problem can finally be controlled. Caleb went completely still in Alexander's arms. And for the first time since Alexander picked him up, Caleb looked afraid of him. After that day, Caleb disappeared from the hospital. At least, that was what most people believed. In reality, Alexander had moved him into the private medical wing inside the Kane estate before sunrise the next morning. Officially, it was for recovery. Professor Chen himself warned that Caleb's condition had become too unstable to continue living alone while working full shifts. Unofficially, Alexander simply refused to let him out of his sight anymore. Caleb realized that almost immediately. The room prepared for him was larger than his entire apartment. The bed felt too soft. The silence felt expensive. Even the curtains probably cost more than everything he owned combined. It made him uncomfortable, especially because Alexander kept appearing without warning. Sometimes with medication, sometimes with food, sometimes just to stand there quietly and ask if Caleb had eaten. At first, Caleb assumed it was guilt. Alexander had discovered the truth and now felt responsible for the Omega who nearly collapsed saving his son. That explanation made sense. Anything else felt dangerous to believe. Still, things slowly changed inside the estate. Leo changed first. The child stopped refusing meals. He slept longer without nightmares. Whenever Caleb sat beside him, Leo relaxed so naturally it no longer seemed accidental. One evening, Leo even dragged his blanket across the room and insisted on sleeping beside Caleb during movie time. "I sleep better here," he muttered sleepily. Alexander watched the scene from the doorway without interrupting. That image stayed with him longer than it should have. For the first time in years, the estate no longer felt cold. And that terrified him more than any business rival ever had. A week later, Caleb finally regained enough strength to walk around properly. He tried helping the staff organize medicine shelves that morning until Alexander found him standing too long. "What are you doing?" Caleb looked startled. "I was only helping. You're supposed to rest." "I've rested enough." "No, you haven't." The response came too quickly. Caleb blinked in surprise while Alexander stepped closer, taking the medicine box from his hands before placing it aside himself. "You still get dizzy walking downstairs." "I'm not fragile." Alexander looked at him quietly for a moment. "You donated blood for 2 years while starving yourself and overworking your body." Caleb immediately looked away. That reaction irritated Alexander strangely. Every time the subject turned toward Caleb himself, the Omega acted like his own suffering was inconvenient to discuss. Later that night, Caleb developed another fever. Professor Chun claimed it was normal recovery exhaustion, but Alexander remained beside the bed long after everyone else left. Around midnight, Caleb woke slightly from the heat pressing against his skin. The room lights were dim. Alexander sat nearby reading through company reports, still wearing half-open dress clothes from work. "You're still here." Alexander glanced up immediately. "Go back to sleep. You have work tomorrow." "So do you." Caleb smiled weakly. "I don't think I'm employed anymore." The joke was soft, but Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "You're not going back there." Caleb frowned. "What?" "That hospital worked you until you collapsed. It wasn't the hospital's fault. It wasn't yours either." Caleb fell silent. Nobody had ever said something like that to him before. Not once. Alexander noticed the confusion in his face immediately. That alone said enough about the life Caleb had lived until now. Without another word, Alexander stood and walked toward the bathroom. When he returned several minutes later, he carried a towel dampened with cold water. Caleb looked genuinely alarmed. "You don't have to do that yourself." Alexander ignored him completely and pressed the towel carefully against his forehead. The cool touch made Caleb inhale softly. Their eyes met briefly. Too close. Too quiet. Something warm and dangerous shifted in the air between them, before Caleb lowered his gaze first. After that night, the distance between them kept shrinking, little by little. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just naturally. Alexander began bringing Caleb meals instead of leaving staff to handle it. Caleb stopped flinching every time Alexander entered the room. Leo eventually started forcing both of them to sit together during meals because he hated eating alone. And somewhere during those quiet evenings, Alexander realized he had started memorizing small things without meaning to. The way Caleb rubbed his wrists when tired. The way he smiled more with Leo than with anyone else. The way his pheromones softened whenever he felt safe. That last realization unsettled Alexander the most, because Caleb only smelled like that around him. One rainy evening, Alexander entered Caleb's room carrying clean laundry the staff had folded incorrectly. He stopped near the doorway immediately. Caleb had fallen asleep sitting against the headboard while reading beside Leo. The child slept curled against his side, clutching Caleb's sleeve tightly even in dreams. For several seconds, Alexander simply watched them. Then his eyes drifted lower. The old needle scars on Caleb's arm were visible again beneath the loose sleeve of his shirt. Something inside Alexander tightened painfully. He crossed the room slowly and sat beside the bed, carefully enough not to wake Leo. Caleb shifted slightly in sleep but did not wake when Alexander gently lifted his arm. The scars looked worse up close. Months. Years. Endless needles. Alexander stared at them silently before lowering his head. Without thinking, his lips brushed lightly against one faded scar near Caleb's wrist. The moment lasted barely a second. But the instant Alexander pulled back, Caleb opened his eyes. Both froze. Caleb's breathing became uneven immediately. "What are you doing?" Alexander should have stepped away. Instead, he remained there, still holding Caleb's wrist carefully in one hand. "I was checking your fever." "That's not what that was." No denial came. The silence between them thickened. Outside, rain struck softly against the windows while Leo continued sleeping peacefully beside them. Then Caleb asked the question he had been holding inside for days. "If I stop being useful, would you still keep me here?" Alexander's expression shifted immediately. Caleb forced himself to continue even though his chest already hurt. "You said I'm not going back to the hospital. Your family wants me to stay here. Everyone keeps talking about my blood like it belongs to you now." His voice dropped lower. "So if I can't donate anymore, what happens to me?" For the first time in a long while, Alexander looked shaken. Because Caleb truly believed that. After everything, the Omega still thought his only value came from what could be taken out of his veins. Alexander slowly reached up and touched Caleb's face. Carefully. Not possessive. Not forceful. Gentle enough that Caleb almost leaned into it without realizing. Then Alexander kissed him. Softly. Briefly. No anger. No rut-driven desperation. No dominance. Just warmth. The kind Caleb had spent his entire life without. When Alexander pulled back slightly, Caleb looked completely stunned. "You think I kept you here because of your blood?" Alexander asked quietly. Caleb could not answer. Because for the first time since entering this estate, he wanted to believe otherwise. But later that same night, everything shattered again. Caleb woke thirsty sometime after midnight and left the room quietly to avoid waking Leo. As he walked past the study downstairs, unfamiliar voices stopped him cold. The Omega's compatibility could stabilize the hereditary condition permanently. "We should secure him before outside families discover this. He doesn't need freedom. He just needs to stay alive." Caleb froze outside the half-open door. Inside, several members of the Kane family sat discussing him like property. Then someone else spoke. If Alexander becomes emotionally attached, it could complicate things. A short silence followed. Then another voice answered coldly. "That won't matter. An alpha like him always chooses bloodline over feelings." Eventually, Caleb's fingers tightened slowly around the glass in his hand. And for the first time since Alexander kissed him, fear returned stronger than hope. Caleb left the estate before sunrise. He did not take much with him. There was nothing there that truly belonged to him anyway. A few clothes. His suppressants. The old phone with a cracked screen he had used for years. Leo's repaired music player sat untouched on the bedside table, because Caleb knew if he took it, the child would cry. That thought almost made him stay. Almost. But the voices from the study repeated endlessly inside his head. He doesn't need freedom. He just needs to stay alive. Caleb had heard similar things his entire life. Different words. Same meaning. Useful Omegas were protected only as long as they remained useful. And Caleb had been foolish enough to believe Alexander might see him differently. By the time the estate staff realized he was gone, Caleb was already back in the tiny apartment building near the hospital district. The hallway smelled damp. The lights flickered every few seconds. His old room was exactly as he remembered it. Cold, cramped, and painfully quiet. After spending weeks hearing Leo's sleepy voice every night, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, slowly pressing one trembling hand against his chest. The silence hurt more than he expected. At the estate, Leo always fell asleep holding onto his sleeve. Alexander always appeared eventually asking whether he had eaten. Even the warmth of the kitchen at night had started feeling familiar. Now all of it felt distant, like something he had imagined alone. Meanwhile, the Kane estate descended into chaos. Within an hour of discovering Caleb was gone, Alexander found the empty room himself. At first, he thought Caleb had gone downstairs with Leo. Then he noticed the untouched medicine beside the bed and the folded blanket left too neatly behind. Something cold settled instantly in his stomach. He checked the security footage less than 10 minutes later. Caleb leaving alone in the dark. No coat thick enough for the weather. Still visibly weak. Alexander replayed the footage twice without speaking. Then his pheromones exploded through the office hard enough to make 2 nearby staff members panic. Find him. Nobody dared hesitate. By afternoon, half the estate security team was searching the city. But Alexander already knew where Caleb would go. People like Caleb always returned to places that hurt them because they believed they deserved nothing better. When Alexander arrived outside the apartment building several hours later, rain had already started pouring heavily across the streets. He climbed a narrow staircase 2 steps at a time before stopping outside Caleb's door. No answer. Alexander knocked harder. Caleb. Still nothing. His instincts screamed something was wrong. The landlord eventually opened the door with a spare key after enough intimidation from Alexander's bodyguards. The moment the door swung open, the scent hit him immediately. Suppressants, fever, and blood. Caleb lay collapsed beside the bed unconscious. For one horrifying second, Alexander thought he was too late. Then he saw the shallow rise and fall of Caleb's chest. Alexander crossed the room instantly and dropped beside him. Caleb's skin burned with fever beneath his hands, but the rest of him felt frighteningly weak. An empty suppressant bottle had rolled across the floor nearby. Idiot, Alexander muttered hoarsely. Not angry. Terrified. Caleb stirred faintly at the sound of his voice. His eyelids lifted halfway before unfocused eyes landed on Alexander. You found me. The quiet resignation in those words hurt more than accusation would have. Alexander's jaw tightened. What the hell were you thinking? Caleb gave a weak smile that looked close to breaking. You shouldn't be here. You disappeared without medication. You still have Leo? The sentence hit harder than Alexander expected, because Caleb truly believed that was the important part. Alexander leaned closer immediately. Look at me. Caleb tried avoiding his eyes again. Alexander's hand closed gently but firmly around his jaw, forcing him to meet his gaze. I didn't come here because of Leo. Caleb's expression trembled slightly. But before either of them could say more, Alexander's phone rang violently in his pocket. One glance at the screen changed everything. Professor Chen. Alexander answered instantly. What happened? The doctor's voice sounded grim. Leo's condition crashed 20 minutes ago. Every muscle in Caleb's body stiffened. He stopped responding to the current treatment. We're stabilizing him now, but if this continues, Professor Chen hesitated briefly. We may not have much time. Caleb pushed himself upright too quickly and nearly collapsed again. I need to go. Alexander grabbed him immediately. You can barely stand. Leo needs me. Your body can't survive another extraction right now. I don't care. The words came out sharp enough to shock both of them. Caleb's breathing became uneven. I don't care what happens to me if Leo dies. Alexander stared at him silently. Then realization hit with brutal clarity. For 2 years, Caleb had never once valued himself separately from what he could give others. Not his health. Not his future. Not even his life. Alexander suddenly understood why hearing those voices in the study shattered him so completely. Because somewhere deep down, Caleb already believed he existed only to be used. The thought made something violent rise inside Alexander's chest. Not toward Caleb. Toward everyone who had made him think that way. Toward himself included. Back at the hospital, the situation worsened rapidly. Leo drifted in and out of consciousness while machines monitored every unstable heartbeat. Nurses rushed around adjusting medication lines while Professor Chen prepared emergency options nobody wanted to discuss aloud. Then Leo woke briefly. His eyes moved weakly around the room. Caleb. The tiny voice nearly destroyed Alexander. Leo's small hand searched weakly across the blanket until Alexander held it carefully. Rest, Alexander said quietly. But Leo shook his head faintly. Did he leave because of me? Alexander froze. Professor Chin looked away silently. Leo's fingers tightened weakly around Alexander's hand. I was good. The child sounded terrified, as if Caleb leaving meant he had done something wrong. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Then he stood. When he returned to Caleb's apartment later that evening, the Omega was gone again. This time, the landlord looked nervous before speaking. He left in a taxi maybe 20 minutes ago. He looked really sick. Alexander immediately understood where Caleb had gone. Of course he did. The hospital. Even now, after everything, Caleb still chose Leo first. Rain poured harder across the city as Alexander drove through traffic fast enough to terrify his driver. By the time he reached the hospital entrance, thunder shook the sky overhead. And there, beneath the heavy rain outside the emergency entrance, Alexander finally saw him. Caleb stood near the hospital steps, soaked completely through. One hand pressed weakly against the wall for balance. He looked like he might collapse at any second. Still, he kept trying to walk forward. Toward Leo. Toward another blood donation that could kill him. Alexander crossed the distance between them immediately and grabbed him before his knees finally gave out. Caleb's body sagged against him instantly. Rain soaked both of them while Caleb struggled weakly to stay conscious. Alexander, he whispered. Alexander held him tighter. And for the first time in his life, fear completely outweighed control. Because if Caleb died now, Alexander already knew he would never recover from it. Then upstairs inside the hospital, emergency alarms suddenly began ringing again from Leo's floor. The sound of the emergency alarms echoed through the hospital like a countdown. Alexander carried Caleb inside without letting go. Rainwater dripped from both of them onto the polished floor, while nurses rushed past in panic toward Leo's room upstairs. Caleb tried forcing himself awake the entire elevator ride. I can still donate, he whispered weakly. Alexander's grip tightened immediately. No, Leo doesn't have time, and neither do you. Caleb looked at him with exhausted eyes that still carried the same stubborn determination Alexander had seen from the very beginning. That terrified him. Even now, standing at the edge of complete physical collapse, Caleb was still willing to destroy himself if it meant Leo could live. The elevator doors opened. Professor Chun was already waiting outside the ICU wing with several doctors behind him. The moment he saw Caleb's condition, his expression darkened. He shouldn't even be standing. No, Alexander answered coldly. Inside Leo's room, machines beeped rapidly around the small bed. Leo looked frighteningly pale beneath the blankets, his breathing uneven as medication lines ran into both arms. Caleb's face immediately changed the moment he saw him. All exhaustion disappeared beneath panic. He stepped forward instinctively before nearly falling again. Alexander caught him around the waist automatically. Leo stirred weakly at the sound of movement. Slowly, his eyes opened. Caleb. The tiny voice shattered whatever control remained inside the room. Caleb moved to the bedside immediately despite everyone trying to stop him. The moment Leo's small fingers wrapped weakly around his hand, the child's breathing steadied slightly. You came back, Leo whispered. Caleb forced a smile even while trembling. Of course I did. Leo's eyes slowly filled with tears. I thought you didn't want me anymore. The words hit like a knife. Alexander looked away briefly because the guilt was unbearable. Caleb immediately shook his head. No, never. Then don't leave again. Caleb opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out, because he did not know if he would survive this time. Professor Chin finally stepped closer after several tense moments. We don't have many options left. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Another transfusion. One that Caleb's body likely could not survive. Alexander's expression hardened instantly. Find another solution. There may not be one. I said find one. Professor Chin looked exhausted. Alexander. No. The single word carried enough force to silence the room. Alexander stepped between Caleb and the doctors immediately, his pheromones turning dangerously sharp. He is not dying for this hospital. Caleb stared at him in shock. One of the senior executives from the Kane family, who had arrived moments earlier, frowned immediately. You're being emotional. Alexander turned slowly. The older Alpha continued coldly. That Omega's compatibility is the only stable variable we have. If the hereditary condition truly reacts to his blood, preserving him under family supervision is the logical decision. Caleb visibly flinched. Alexander noticed instantly, and something inside him finally snapped completely. For once in your lives, Alexander said quietly, stop talking about him like he's property. The executive's face darkened. Watch your tone. No. You watch yours. The entire hallway fell silent. Nobody had ever heard Alexander speak to his family like that before. The older Alpha's expression hardened. You would throw away your inheritance over an Omega? Alexander answered without hesitation. Yes. Even Caleb looked stunned. Alexander stepped closer slowly, eyes colder than anyone in the room had ever seen. You all keep talking about bloodlines, he said. But for 2 years, while this family discussed strategy and inheritance, Caleb was the only reason Leo survived it all. Nobody spoke. Not one of you protected him. Not one of you cared whether he lived or died as long as you could keep using him. Alexander's voice dropped lower. I won't let that happen anymore. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Then Caleb spoke quietly behind him. Alexander. For the first time since meeting him, Alexander looked genuinely afraid when turning back toward him. Caleb's hand shook slightly at his sides. I still want to do it. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Caleb, if there's still a chance to save Leo, I can't walk away. Caleb's voice broke softly. He's family too. That word hit Alexander harder than anything else. Family. Caleb still considered Leo family. Even after believing he had only been valued for his blood. Professor Chen finally spoke carefully. A reduced extraction might stabilize Leo temporarily without completely overwhelming Caleb's body. It's dangerous, but possible. Alexander hated every part of this. But when he looked at Leo lying weakly in bed, and then at Caleb standing there despite barely remaining conscious himself, he realized something. Neither of them would survive losing the other. Several hours later, the transfusion began. This time, Alexander never left Caleb's side. Not for 1 second. He sat beside the medical chair holding Caleb's hand while the machines worked carefully under Professor Chen's supervision. Every time Caleb's eyes drifted shut from exhaustion, Alexander tightened his grip slightly until he focused again. You should rest, Caleb whispered weakly at one point. Alexander brushed damp hair back from his forehead carefully. You first. Caleb gave the faintest smile. Hours passed painfully slowly. Then finally, Leo's condition stabilized. The change was small at first. His heart rate evened out. His fever began dropping gradually. The violent alarm surrounding his bed finally stopped. Professor Chen exhaled heavily in relief. He's responding. The entire room relaxed for the first time all night. Caleb's body immediately sagged afterward, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline completely. Alexander caught him before he slipped sideways from the chair. Easy. Caleb blinked tiredly up at him. Leo's okay? He will be. The relief in Caleb's face nearly broke Alexander apart. Not once had he asked whether he himself would survive. Only Leo. Alexander lowered his forehead gently against Caleb's, and finally said the words he should have said much earlier. I need you. Caleb's breath caught slightly. Alexander's voice dropped quieter. Not your blood. Not what you can give me. Just you. For several seconds, Caleb simply stared at him, like he wanted desperately to believe it but still did not know how. So Alexander kissed him again. Slowly. Carefully. This time, Caleb kissed him back. Weeks later, the hospital felt different somehow. Leo no longer cried during treatments. His recovery remained slow, but for the first time, the doctors spoke about a future instead of survival percentages. Professor Chen eventually forced Caleb into extended medical leave under threat of physically locking him out of the donation wing forever. Alexander supported the decision immediately. The Kane family, meanwhile, learned very quickly that Alexander meant every word he said. Several inheritance meetings ended badly after he openly threatened to cut ties with anyone who treated Caleb like an asset again. Surprisingly, he never took those words back. But there was something else, too. Something Caleb had been avoiding. His heat. The suppressants had stopped working completely. Professor Chen explained it was a natural consequence of his body finally recovering after years of suppression. His omega biology was catching up. All at once. And Alexander could smell it. Every single day, the scent grew stronger, sweeter, more insistent. It drove him insane. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning. Caleb woke drenched in sweat, his entire body burning from the inside out. His legs trembled when he tried to stand. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. And his scent. God, his scent. It had flooded the entire room overnight. Warm honey and something deeper. Something that made Alexander's alpha instinct snarl with need the moment he opened the bedroom door. Alexander froze in the doorway. Caleb looked up at him with glassy, fever-bright eyes. His cheeks were flushed. His lips were parted. And his hands were shaking where they gripped the bedsheets. Alexander, he breathed. The sound of his name, like that, in that voice, nearly destroyed every shred of Alexander's control. Your heat, Alexander said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded weakly. The suppressants, they're not. I know. Alexander could barely think straight. The scent was everywhere. And there, on the sheets, on Caleb's skin, his knot throbbed painfully behind his briefs. You need to leave, Caleb whispered. Alexander didn't move. Alexander, please, Caleb's voice cracked. I can't. If you stay, I won't be able to. Won't be able to what? Caleb made a small, broken sound. Control myself. Alexander crossed the room before his mind caught up with his body. He knelt beside the bed and reached for Caleb's face, tilting it up gently. What if I don't want you to control yourself? Caleb's eyes widened. Alexander, I'm not thinking clearly. My heat. I've wanted you for months, Alexander said quietly. Long before your heat started. This doesn't change that. Caleb's breath hitched. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Alexander leaned closer. His lips brushed against Caleb's ear, and he felt the omega shiver. I want to take care of you. I want to be the one who makes you feel good. I want to knot you so deep you forget anyone else ever existed. Caleb moaned. Actually moaned. Alexander. Tell me no, Alexander said. Tell me to leave, and I will. I'll lock myself in my office until this passes. But if you don't say no. Caleb kissed him. It was desperate and messy and perfect. Caleb's fingers tangled in Alexander's hair, pulling him closer. His body arched off the bed, pressing against Alexander's chest. Please, Caleb gasped against his lips. Please, I've needed you for so long. Alexander growled low in his throat. He laid Caleb back against the pillows and stripped off his own shirt. Caleb's hands immediately found his bare skin, tracing down his chest, his stomach, stopping at the waistband of his pants. Please, Caleb whispered again. Alexander leaned down and kissed him slowly this time. Deeply. He poured everything into it. Every moment of watching Caleb suffer in silence. Every hour spent terrified of losing him. Every night lying awake thinking about nothing but the Omega who had saved his son. When he pulled back, Caleb's eyes were wet. Why are you crying? I'm not. Caleb lied. Alexander kissed the tears from his cheeks. Yes, you are. I've never. Caleb swallowed hard. I've never been with anyone like this. Not during a heat. Not ever. Something protective and possessive surged through Alexander's chest. No one. Caleb shook his head. I couldn't. The suppressants. I was always afraid someone would take advantage. or that I'd be used. Alexander's jaw tightened. Never again, he said. No one will ever use you again. Do you understand? Caleb nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. Alexander kissed him again, then lower. Down his jaw. Down his neck. He paused at the juncture where Caleb's neck met his shoulder, where his scent was strongest. Can I? Alexander asked roughly. Caleb's body trembled beneath him. You want to. I want to mark you so every alpha in the world knows you're mine. The words hung in the air between them. Caleb's eyes searched his face. You mean that? I've never meant anything more. Caleb's hand found Alexander's and squeezed. Then yes. Yes, please. Alexander bit down. Not hard enough to break skin. Not yet. Just enough to taste. Just enough to make Caleb gasp and arch beneath him. Alexander, I'm going to take care of you. Alexander murmured against his throat. I'm going to take you apart piece by piece. And when you come back together, you're going to be mine. Caleb sobbed. I already am. What followed was hours of heat-soaked desperation. Alexander learned every sound Caleb made. The soft whimpers when he kissed his neck. The sharp gasp when he touched his chest. The broken moan when he finally pushed inside. Caleb was tight and hot and perfect. And the way he said Alexander's name, like a prayer, like a plea, made Alexander want to stay inside him forever. More, Caleb begged. Please, more. Shoo. Alexander kissed his forehead. I've got you. He moved slowly at first. Gently. Caleb's first time deserved gentleness. But Caleb's heat made patience impossible. Harder, Caleb demanded, nails digging into Alexander's back. I won't break. Please. Alexander lost control. He fucked Caleb the way he had wanted to for months. Desperately. Possessively. Like Caleb was the only thing keeping him alive. And when Caleb came, screaming Alexander's name, body clenching around him, Alexander's knot swelled, locking them together. Caleb's eyes flew open. Oh, God. Shoo. Alexander pressed kisses to his face, his lips, his tear-wet cheeks. I've got you. Just breathe. Caleb trembled beneath him as Alexander's knot pulsed deep inside. I can feel you, Caleb whispered. So deep. That's the point. Alexander's hand moved down between them, finding Caleb's spent cock and stroking gently. Caleb cried out. I can't, You can. Alexander's voice was dark, commanding. One more. Give me one more. Caleb sobbed as another orgasm ripped through him, triggered by Alexander's not pressing against places no one had ever touched before. Afterward, they lay tangled together while Alexander's knot slowly went down. Caleb's fingers traced lazy patterns on Alexander's chest. You really meant it, Caleb said quietly. About wanting me. Before the heat. I told you. I know. Caleb swallowed. I've never been anyone's first choice. Alexander rolled onto his side and cupped Caleb's face in his hands. Listen to me. You're not my first choice. You are my only choice. There is no one else. There never will be. Caleb's eyes filled with tears again, and this time he didn't hide them. But something else happened during the heat. Something neither of them expected. 2 weeks later, Caleb woke up nauseous. At first, he blamed it on leftover exhaustion, then on stress, then on absolutely anything except what his omega instincts were screaming at him. Until the third morning, when he threw up before breakfast and Alexander found him kneeling on the bathroom floor. Caleb, I'm fine. You're not fine. Alexander knelt beside him and pressed a hand to his forehead. No fever. But something else, something in Caleb's scent had changed. Alexander's eyes widened. Caleb, what? When was your last heat? Caleb's blood ran cold. Why? Your scent. Alexander's voice was careful, controlled, like he was trying not to panic. It's different. Caleb's hands flew to his stomach. No. Professor Chen. No. I can't. I'm not. Alexander caught his hands. Breathe. I can't be. Caleb's voice cracked. I can't. I don't even know if I. Then we'll find out. Professor Chin confirmed it 3 hours later. Caleb was pregnant. The Omega sat in the medical wing of the Kane estate, staring at the ultrasound image like it might disappear if he looked away. But it didn't disappear. There, small and perfect, was a tiny heartbeat. That's... Caleb's voice failed him. Approximately 6 weeks, Professor Chin said gently. Given your medical history, we'll need to monitor you closely. But so far, everything looks healthy. 6 weeks. The same week as his heat. Alexander's child. Caleb looked up at the alpha, who stood frozen beside his chair. You're not saying anything. Alexander's throat worked. I'm trying not to say the wrong thing. What's the right thing? Alexander knelt beside him and took his hands. I'm terrified, he admitted. I'm terrified because your body almost failed 2 months ago. I'm terrified because pregnancy is dangerous for any Omega, let alone one who spent 2 years destroying herself for my son. Caleb's eyes stung. But I'm also... Alexander swallowed. I'm also happier than I've ever been. Because there's you carrying my child, it means you're not leaving. It means you're staying. It means you're mine. Caleb laughed wetly. I was already yours. Now everyone will know it. Alexander pressed a kiss to his stomach. Then another. Then another. Caleb's fingers threaded through his hair. We need to tell Leo, Caleb said softly. Alexander looked up. Are you sure? He's going to be a big brother. He deserves to know. Leo took the news exactly the way Caleb expected. By demanding to feel the baby kick immediately. It's too small for that yet, Caleb explained, laughing. Then when? Soon. Leo pressed his small hand against Caleb's stomach anyway. I'm going to teach them everything. How to build Legos. How to sneak cookies before dinner. How to what? Alexander asked from the doorway. Leo froze guiltily. Alexander raised an eyebrow. How to eat vegetables without complaining. Leo tried. Caleb burst out laughing. Alexander crossed the room and sat beside them, pulling both Caleb and Leo against his chest. I love you, he said quietly. Caleb leaned into him. I love you too. Gross, Leo muttered. But he didn't move away. The months that followed were the happiest of Caleb's life. His pregnancy was difficult, his body still recovering from years of malnutrition and blood loss. But Alexander never left his side. Not during the sleepless nights. Not during the dizzy spells. Not during the terrifying moment at 7 months when the doctors thought they might lose the baby. They didn't lose the baby. On a warm spring morning, with Alexander holding his hand and Leo sitting nervously in a corner, Caleb gave birth to a healthy alpha son, Ethan. Alexander wept. Caleb had never seen him cry before. Not during Leo's worst moments. Not during Caleb's collapse. Not during the confrontation with his family. But holding their newborn son, Alexander Kane cried like his heart was breaking and mending at the same time. He's perfect, Alexander whispered. Caleb looked down at the tiny, squirming baby in his arms. He had spent so long believing his only value came from what he could give. His blood. His body. His silence. But looking at Alexander, looking at Leo, looking at their son, Caleb finally understood. He had never been valuable because of what he gave. He had always been valuable because of who he was. The Kane family never bothered them again. Alexander made sure of that. He restructured the entire family trust, removed every executive who had spoken about Caleb like property, and made it absolutely clear that anyone who so much as looked at his Omega wrong would regret it for the rest of their very short lives. Caleb never went back to cleaning hospital floors. Instead, he became head of the Kane Family Medical Foundation, a position Alexander created specifically for him. Every year, the foundation funded research into rare blood diseases. Every year, it provided free suppressants to Omegas who couldn't afford them. Every year, It reminded Caleb that his suffering had not been meaningless. But the thing Caleb loved most wasn't the foundation. It was nights like this. Sitting on a couch in the estate's living room, Leo curled against one side and baby Ethan sleeping on his chest. Alexander beside him, one arm wrapped around all three of them. Happy? Alexander asked quietly. Caleb looked around the room. At the fire crackling in the hearth. At Leo's sleepy face. At Ethan's tiny fingers curled around his shirt. At Alexander's eyes, warm and soft in a way they never used to be. Yeah, Caleb said. I really am. Alexander kissed his temple. Good. Because you deserve it. And for the first time in his life, Caleb believed it.